I would like to know, the reason that we asked you to come, and by the way, you've all fulfilled that admirably, is to give us illustrations of how you have integrated ethics into your own in your own respective international experiences and activities in neuroscience. I was searching in all three presentations, and I trust, Dr. Rose, that you're still with us.
Yeah, I am.
Good. I was searching in all three presentations for what would be sort of the common, what's the one single, or maybe it's not one single, but what is a common baseline caution that you would give us, or let's not call it caution, encouragement that you would give us to pursue as we step out on this, advising the White House on this BRAIN project? What is the, be certain that you inject this? What would that be?
If I have a first go, the others reflect. I mean, I think one of the things that came out of our report very strongly for me was that there's an awful lot of activity for which we're not getting the best scientific benefit because it's fragmented. So part of our recommendations around registers to enable us to find out what we've learned is how do we try and make sure that this currently fragmented set of enterprises comes together in a way that we can maximize what's been learned for common good.
That's interesting, almost an inventory before one gets going.
We have in the UK quite a concentrated set of professionals now who are organised in a relatively small number of professional societies, and therefore it's possible for us to get quite quickly to people and say, wouldn't it make sense if you said to all your members, if you're going to be doing this, you need to register when you do it, what you've learned from it, so that actually collectively you can create a base from which hypotheses can be generated and experiments designed. What we particularly found was the mixture of therapeutic and non-therapeutic uses, the fact that you had a lot of sort of last resort type uses of emerging technologies meant that we didn't think we were learning as quickly from this as we potentially could. And it would be similar for things like the emergence of keyhole surgery, minimal access surgery, and like where early on quite a lot happened in the UK before we collected the data, and we could accelerate the development of good science by pulling it together.
We had a recommendation like that in SynBio, as you recall.
Could I?
Yes, please, Dr. Rose.
Because that follows directly on from Jonathan's remark. I've, over the last few years, been doing some work on the history and contemporary nature of neuroscience, and you're struck by the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of papers published every year in neuroscience. I think probably around 100,000 refereed journal papers in neuroscience. There is a huge amount of research going on out there, but it's very, very fragmented. It's fragmented between different subspecialisms, it's fragmented between different learned societies, it's fragmented between different institutional forms. And at least one of the main objectives of the Human Brain Project is to try and find some way of integrating and coordinating all this huge amount of research that's already been done. Now, the HBP is not the only project to try and do that, to try and get the researchers and the research to speak to one another. There are many other projects like this, but I think that certainly sort of picks up on one of the themes that Jonathan says. Surely, if we're spending all this money on neuroscience as we are across the world, there's some kind of obligation to bring together and coordinate the results. And the other side of that is that there is a huge amount of data in hospital records, in the records of clinical trials, in the records of individual patients with brain disorders. There's genetic data, there's brain scanning data, and so on. And at the moment, a lot of that data, although it may be used in specific pieces of research, is not brought together. And again, rather than or before we feel that we need to make another huge research endeavor, perhaps there's a kind of ethical obligation to make the best of the data that we have. And again, that's an aim of the Human Brain Project, this coordination, integration of data to try and find out what we know already and what we know we don't know already. And the last thing I'd say is it's obviously it's a little awkward to be contributing at a distance like this because eye contact is quite difficult. Your rather blurry little images on my screen. So just whilst I'm speaking, the other thing I wanted to pick up was something that Dr. Gutman mentioned in the previous session and also came up in the report that I was involved in that Jonathan mentioned on novel neurotechnologies. If we're going to work in this area seriously, we have to work in this area modestly. We have to be very, very aware of what we know we don't know, and of the huge gulf, the absolutely huge gulf that there is between our understanding of brain processes at the neuromolecular level and our understanding of mental states at the level at which we experience them in our everyday lives as human beings in social encounters in a social world. Both the reports on the Brain Project and the report on the Human Brain Project are very honest and open about how much we don't know. And I think if we make rash predictions and rash promises about where we're going to be in 3, 5, or 10 years' time, those promises won't only not be backed up by the science, but they'll lead to disillusion. They'll lead to people thinking, okay, we've invested all this money, but where are the results? So I think humility, I believe that's the term that we used in the Nuffield report, and maybe that Dr. Gutman mentioned before. I think humility on everybody's part about the length of the journey we have to travel is also a real advice, a real issue that I think we need to be aware of.
Thank you. Dr. Simplici.
Well, I have three very simple and clear suggestions which build on the 3 points I tried to make. The first is education. This morning, not coincidentally, Professor Koch's presentation immediately triggered a strong reaction. And this is the issue we have to face. Our old traditional concept of conscience, responsibility, free will, the relevance of language as a specific human ability are not completely out of date. I'm not expressing the wish that they go out of date or out of market, if you do prefer, but we need to rebuild on a more appropriate basis, considering what the outcomes of scientific development are. So this is the first point I would like to make and suggest. Education. It is not just about discussing these issues in the Faculty of Medicines. It is exactly an interdisciplinary work which calls on all of us to a renewed commitment to thinking of the solid, robust grounds of our individual and social life. Education. The second one is law. There is already a great deal of literature on that. I think that we are going to face a new wave, not only of literature, but of decisions made in the courts. And this is a challenge not only for the systems of civil law, this is a challenge for everyone in the UK, in the United States. We have to anticipate it, and in order not to simply give up the notions of responsibility, think of the notion of mens rea. What is likely to become of our criminal code once we get rid of the idea of mens rea? If there is no mens rea, because there is just brain working, there is no responsibility, there is no legitimacy to charge someone with a crime, not to mention a sin. The third one is benefit. Benefit and sharing of benefit. Jonathan mentioned the question of the difference between therapeutic and non-therapeutic use. It is not easy to draw the line. So I think that a commission like this and like all commissions like this everywhere in the world should take the commitment to help people and of course policy makers to draw the line. Well, I could mention the idea of something like deliberative democracy, but it is not even the case. But we need something like that, because it is very difficult to draw the line. And once you get the line, that is, you are at the threshold, and then there is non-therapeutic use, there is an enhancing use, many problems arise. So we have to draw the line and then to decide how to share the benefits that result from this this unprecedented scientific development.
I was going to ask Mr. Montgomery to expand, if he would, a little bit on the reasons to single out sham neurosurgery, because that may help us in thinking about other technologies and neuroscience.
I wish you hadn't asked me that, because I mean, I think that's the question: is this different about the neurology context, or is it equivalent to placebos in other areas? And I think that's where the discussion is going on between the Council and the Health Research Authority at the moment. The Health Research Authority's meeting of the National Research Ethics Advisor panel has drawn the literature around the use of controls and placebos more generally, and thinks that there isn't anything especially different about the brain context. At the very least, at the Council, we think that if researchers are unclear about how they should design trials and whether it's acceptable to use sham surgery, that it may well be that we don't get the learning that we need moving forward. We may do things without understanding. We may do the trials without the controls and then act as if that's secure, whereas actually we haven't been able to do the methodologies in the way that were appropriate. Nick was probably more involved in the discussions around the sham surgery issue than I would know. I can see him nodding. Do you want to add to that, Nick?
I'm sorry, perhaps everybody else knows what sham surgery is, and I'm not sure I do. Would you clarify that?
Well, I mean, essentially, if you're trying to run a blind randomized controlled trial, you need
So
a
it's
lot of people who not only are not getting the intervention,
Got it.
but also that the people doing it don't know.
I was afraid that's what it was, yes.
You certainly wouldn't want a double-blind
Yes.
sham neurosurgery, but there are issues about what patients know.
I was afraid of that,
Yes.
yes.
Nick probably knows more about that.
Dr. Rose, were you to make a comment before I go to Christine?
Well, I think you might want to just think about deep brain stimulation. Okay, now is it legitimate to do sham surgery in deep brain stimulation? Deep brain stimulation involves, even, although it's much more sophisticated these days than it used to, a rather invasive brain operation, the implantation of electrodes and then the stimulation of those electrodes. Now, what would be the sham surgery equivalent of doing that? Would it be the operation? Would it be the insertion of the electrodes? Would it be the electrodes non-functioning and so on? One of the things that we know about certain kinds of disorders, and of course this is not just brain disorders, is how susceptible they are to the placebo effect. But if we're really wanting to test the efficacy of deep brain stimulation, we do have to do the kinds of controlled experiments that Jonathan mentioned. And yet, an unnecessary intervention into that most delicate organ of the brain that we really, and I sort of stress this again and again, we know so little about, an unnecessary intervention into that is ethically problematic and probably publicly a little bit controversial, rather more than, say, a sham surgery on your knee or a sham surgery on your back.
just follow up a second, but in a principled way, again, this is part of the debate I guess you're having between the two councils in the UK, is there a reason for a difference other than degree of danger, the degree of invasiveness, et cetera, something, special and privileged about the neurologic side of this?
I don't know if Jonathan wants to answer that, but just as a member of the working party, sorry, I'm now speaking with a slightly different hat on than the Human Brain Project hat, but as a member of that working party, we did start from the view that the brain was, for all the reasons that we understand, a very special organ, an organ about which we had less knowledge and its functioning than other organs, and therefore an organ that required special protections. So in that light, the bar that had to be met if you were going to do something like sham surgery in the brain was higher than that with another organ that you understood better.
Let's move to Christine. Actually, I called you Anita. Do you want to be on the list, Anita? Thank you.
So actually, I was actually going to
Don't
ask
go
the
there.
same, I was going to actually ask the same question as Dan is, but now I'm going to just shape it slightly differently, because there were some other things that you talked about that I think one can imagine need attention, like research culture, the funding structures, the lack of regulatory consistency on innovation, things like that. In those areas, do you think there's anything specific to neuroscience, or any reason that they're more important to pay attention to in the novel emerging neurotechnologies? Or are they just problematic the way we probably all know that they are?
Nick may have slightly different views on this. I think the answer is nearest to no. I don't think they're unique, because actually the themes that emerged from the Novel Neurotechnologies report were very similar to the ones that emerged from our report on emerging biotechnologies. And they were the need to have a broader public debate around how we assessed what was in the public good, how we made funding decisions, how we committed ourselves to one line of development with the opportunity costs of therefore not committing to others. I think there are, at any particular point in time, there will be reasons to use particular examples to work through the principles. And I think the answer to the sham surgery one is probably the principles are the same principles, but given what we know and don't know about the brain, it makes a lot of sense to work out how to apply them at this point in time in a way that is dedicated to the sham neurosurgery. So in that sense, I can see where there's common ground on the debate between the two councils. I'm sure it'll work its way through to some form of solution. Similarly, I think there are reasons about public anxiety. There are reasons why the questions we have about the brain resonate with deep anxieties around personality, identity, responsibility. I think if you step back and took a historical view, though, you would say that exactly those same anxieties around mens rea and responsibility emerged out of various forms of social and economic determinism. I think it's the particular point at which those anxieties manifest themselves as opposed to being unique. So I think we have a lot of resources to draw on.
Dr. Simplici wanted to comment on that.
Yes, I think there is a difference. Exactly because of the perspectives of enhancement that are implied in this field of research. We know of authors like Savulescu and Persons who consider a world where moral enhancement should be quite accepted, is not considered as a due practice. So this is really something different. And in this sense, to draw the line between therapeutic and non-therapeutic use is in itself a challenge, which is not only to be considered with respect to technical difficulties or invasive techniques, because the same result is likely to be obtained with less invasive techniques, maybe simply with a drug which can produce the effect of enhancing memory, increasing intellectual activity, eliminating unpleasant memories, and so on. So the difference is in the possible outcome. That is why the non-therapeutic use of this knowledge entails a greater social public responsibility.
But that difference means different funding mechanisms or different regulatory structures or different research culture? That's what I was asking. You know, I understand the differences that you just described, but, you know, how do they affect these bigger issues of research culture and funding?
I wonder if I could invite Nick to say something here, because he came to talk to the European National Ethics Committee and he raised some really interesting points about what were perceived by people about decisions based on observations, but were actually in fact based on simulations because of the way in which the technology emerges. And for me, no, I think in many ways this is similar to other debates about enhancement, but there are some big risks that we believe we know more than we do, and that we allow shaky knowledge to be as if it was a more secure foundation. I don't know, Nick, if you'd want to, you might have been cut off in your prime about to talk about it, but it was really influential at the National Ethics
If I may, yes, let me just comment a little bit on that. My role in the Human Brain Project is to run the Foresight Lab. And foresight is a hard thing.
Nick, we'll pick you up later, Nick. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll pick you up when we get connected. We'll get a few more questions in the meantime. I have Nita, Steve, and Anita. Nita first.
We like to keep it confusing over here with us law folks. I want to just make a comment, which is to encourage us to be quite careful in our claims about the ways in which neuroscience impacts different institutions, like the legal institution in particular, from my perspective. So I agree with Jonathan that these kinds of forms of determinism have shown up many times in the past, from Twinkie defenses to social and environmental determinism. And each and every time there's a new innovation, there's this belief that the criminal justice system is going to come crumbling to, its knees, and that all of the bases for what we've claimed in the past are going to suddenly go away. When in fact, when you look carefully at our legal system, there are many normative commitments that underlie different issues like mens rea, and that those concepts, as they're understood in the legal system, have very specific and nuanced meanings that are not based just on a black box of not knowing what's happening in the brain. At the same time, I think that neuroscience is a uniquely valuable lens by which we can examine many of our normative commitments in law and in other areas. It can help us understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And in fact, that's one of the ways in which I think neuroscience has been most useful to our criminal justice system, is to ask, what do we mean by concepts like voluntariness and mental state? Why do we punish people? Do we continue to believe that those justifications make sense as we have a better understanding of how, not why, but how some of the underlying mechanisms in the human brain take place. And so since we've talked a lot about the importance of not overstating the science, I think it's also very important that we not overstate how it will revolutionize different areas and institutions and commitments in those areas, in particular in law.
I always take the prerogative chair as underlining things that I think will represent things that the Bioethics Commission wants to do in its report. And I would underline that just as we want to make clear how important it is for a pathway for neuroscience to progress, to, ask practitioners not to exaggerate in the interests of truth, of the fundamental basis of science, which is exposing carefully the truth. So it is that we want to make sure that people who practice ethics and practical do not exaggerate the way, which has happened time and again, which doesn't make it good. It's a bad thing when it happens, when some new knowledge base comes out. All of a sudden, the responsibility basis of the law is going to be undermined. Many people, long before neuroscience developed to the extent it is now, believed, as I do, that the brain underpins the mind, and that malfunctioning of the brain would have effects, and people's ability to abide by the law. But that doesn't, it didn't then and it doesn't now undermine a lot of what the law is based on. So just to underline that, I think we could do a public as well as an ethical and scientific service to try to expound very clearly on that. And so thank you. I mean, I think, I see nods, but I think it's important. And
Let's try to get these
let's try to
last
get-
two questions in, and then we can come back to enhancements also when we have the roundtable session. Steve?
So my question was to Dr. Rose, to Nick also, and I was quite taken by the concept of the Foresight Lab that you are directing, and wanted to understand in a bit more detail how this is integrated and embedded in the specific projects of the Human Brain Project. And it may well be too early, but are there any early ideas that you've gleaned about what might work well?
In many ways, it is too early. As I was going to say, foresight is quite hard, especially when it's about the future. It's kind of easier when it's about the past. I think the one thing that I would want to stress about the Foresight Lab, and it does link quite nicely to some of the points that have just been made, is that this is an attempt to actually think through, on the basis of empirical evidence, social evidence, and one's understanding of the social and political context in which these scientific results are going to impact, what is likely to happen. And this links to Dr. Gutman's remarks, because a lot of what happens in new and emerging technologies, especially from the ethical point of view, is highly speculative and really overstates what the science can actually do. Take, for instance, the arguments about whether or not neuroimaging can read human intentions. Now, the difference between what is studied in the lab under the heading of volition and any human intention that any of colleagues here might have in organizing their everyday life is absolutely huge. There is absolutely no way at the moment where brain imaging can read any of those intentions in any actionable or practicable way. Take the example of enhancement, which I know has been the subject of much debate and much moral exploration. But if you actually look at the results of students, for instance, who've taken so-called enhancing drugs, you see that the consequences of those drugs have not been that different from the consequences of other drugs. They exacerbate certain capacities for a certain limited amount of time, for instance, concentration and acuity, and they limit other capacities at the very same time, and they have similar kinds of consequences afterwards of come down, of exhaustion, of depression, etc., etc., etc. So before we run away with the idea of these things having very revolutionary effects that are going to challenge our very understanding of who we are, our view, and the Foresight Lab's view, is that we need to be very realistic about the science, and we need to locate the emergence of those technologies and the uses of those technologies in the practices and institutions that are likely to take them up. And the example of the law, I think, is a very, very good one, where one sees legal systems across Europe and across the United States struggling with these new forms of knowledge, integrating them into their existing practices, maybe to some extent questioning their practices, but they're certainly not overturning our very ideas of criminal responsibility for reasons that many legal scholars have pointed out at great length. You know, if we're wrong about the fact that human beings, by and large, intend the meanings of their acts and therefore can be held culpable for the meanings, for the acts that they undertake, if we're wrong about that, then we're wrong about almost everything that we've ever thought about human beings. And I don't think neuroscience is going to lead us to that belief. Now, the question of how this is integrated back into the project is again being quite realistic about how, say, our increasing capacity to predict the consequences of genetic or neurobiological anomalies in future disorders, and then to develop strategies to intervene in them, to try and think through what might be involved in those practices of screening and early intervention. For instance, in the light of everything else that we already know and the controversies that we already have about screening and early intervention in mammography for asymptomatic women over 45, or the PSA test that has been such a controversial issue in the United States. So before we suddenly think, okay, we're going to screen, we're going to identify risk factors, and we're going to intervene, we need to locate those questions in a realistic social and political context. That's what we're trying to do. How effective we'll be in building those back into the research programs of our colleagues, that's another question. We are committed to doing that, and our colleagues are committed to doing that, and have been since the beginning, but it's a work in progress.
Thank you. Final question, Anita.
Okay, I had two comments for Dr. Rose. One is about your interesting comment, there are 100,000 refereed papers on neuroscience, and I wondered why? I mean, why has the scientific community not, with foresight, integrated the research in some important way? The second thing I want to sort of say, as opposed to ask, is about your, I thought I heard you say, in connection with the sham surgery, I wrote down, we do have to do this, you know. So I'm wondering what lack of caution might be involved in the notion that we have to do these sham surgeries, we have to do these sort of placebo surgeries, despite the risk and safety. And you, as you probably would guess, your scientific understanding of risk and safety might be very different from that of the general public. For Dr. Montgomery, I want to ask a question, maybe also for Dr. Simplici too. Dr. Montgomery, you listed safety, autonomy, privacy, equity, and trust as the main principles governing this research in your European context. Are there any principles at play in your part of the world that are different from principles at play in our part of the world? When we debated and discussed synthetic biology, we discovered that the American approach to synbio was a little bit different from the European ethical approach to synbio. Are principles like proportionality or dignity or some other principles at play in Europe, human rights, that are not at play in the U.S. Bioethics context?
Who do you want to go to first on?
Maybe Dr.
Do you want me to go
Rose?
first? I'll go first and be quick. Yes, I'm terribly sorry for that normative. We must do that about sham surgery. I suppose the point I was trying to make, I hope backing up what Jonathan made and our report made, is that it's necessary to use the best means that we have to rigorously interrogate the claims that are being made in these areas. Many big claims are being made for something like deep brain stimulation. I really hope that a lot of them are true. But we need to find the best techniques that we can to scientifically evaluate those claims. There are a lot of problems with evidence-based medicine, but it's the only system that we have in order really to evaluate claims, especially when those claims are bound up, as we know they are, with the commercial interests.
But do we have lines we simply will not cross? Maybe sham surgery is one of those places where we don't.
I think it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Steve, would you be willing to say something on, I mean, because Steve really
Good, yeah,
practices in, not in the area of deep, no, but he's a practicing neuroscience.
In maybe a practicing neuroscientist in need of some education. I've argued for the importance of sham surgery in some of the early attempts to look at the effects of deep brain stimulation for movement disorders, and the ethical implications of that are less, or maybe the least, in this whole arena, because lesions are made as part of the alternative therapy. So one is also asking, does the implantation of a wire and stimulation provide more benefit or different benefit than a lesion that we know provides some benefit? Without sham surgery, many groups have used for DBS, on versus off, which is another way to do that, and the sham is when the machine is turned off. So there are different ways to approach it. I think that to perform intracranial surgery for placebo purposes, that goes beyond at least my experience. When we're speaking about cell-based therapy, I guess these are issues that we will that may be faced. Is that helpful? And especially for things like depression, where this is or other affective or behavioral disorders where we have never at least haven't thought happily in 40 years about intracranial surgical approaches for these conditions. This would, I would think, be above and beyond. One of the very good points about some of these treatments is that sometimes observational studies that are not blinded can be adequate when one sees an effect that is very different from the natural history of the underlying disease.
And finally, Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you. I guess I should say I'm not Dr. Montgomery. We have a different system of academic titles. A lot harder to be a professor than a doctor, but I'm not a doctor in our system. That's right. Anyway, I think I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of firm red lines that you never cross, because whenever I've come across them, you always tend to revise those a bit later on. I think go back to the question about, are the principles similar or different? And I think the position we would want to take is that we should ask the question whether, in order to generate the appropriate knowledge, scientific knowledge and other knowledge that we need to test out claims and move forward, we do or do not need to carry out sham surgery. So that raises the questions of balancing what it is we're trying to find out, what other ways there are of finding them out. There's a whole set of issues around consent, and our experience of novel therapies is actually, it can often be quite easy to get consent to people where they think it's their last resort, in circumstances where it might look from outside a rather unwise thing to do. And there's a genuine question, I think, in the particular context of neurosurgery around the questions of informed consent and how it operates. On the one hand, you may wish to say you would only do this on the basis of informed consent, and therefore you just describe the trauma that would be created from doing it. And on the other hand, the people who may be most likely to benefit from it may be least able to may not so much least that we may be more uncomfortable about accepting the choices that they make because of the very need that's there. So I think this is about, I think the really difficult question is there anything that is so special about the brain that we don't have the conceptual resources already there to work their way through? And I don't think that's what the Nuffield report suggests. I think Nuffield report suggests that this is a new enough context that we need clarity about when it may or may not be appropriate to do it. And if we need clarity, it's really important that clarity is made available to the researchers, who shouldn't be expected to guess what the rest of us might think, do it, and then we come back later on and criticise them. We need to be having that debate up front.
The three of you, please do not go far. In about 10 minutes, actually, 2:30, we want to reconvene for, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Just two short observations. The first, I stress once again the importance of education, just because of the fact that I completely agree with what has been said. Claims are to be assessed, and claims in this field concern two big promises, wishes and desires of human beings. So education is the first step. And the second observation is very important, because when we look at these as well as other problems at the global level, we have to consider that the principles are not the same. They converge maybe, but are not the same. The consent is an illustrative example. The experience and practice, the theory and practice of consent in many countries is quite different than the theory and practice of consent we are used to in our countries. So we have to look at that very carefully when we enter the global space of bioethics. Otherwise, conflicts are likely to arise.
Point well made. Thanks to the three of you.